Good evening, everyone. Um, let me start my camera. That way everybody can see me, see who I am. Good evening, everyone. I'm Manuel Miranda. Everybody ends up calling me Manny. I am the current president of the ASCMP Texas chapter. Welcome to this session this evening on change how you change, design thinking and organizational change management. The uh, the speaker for this evening is my colleague and business partner Malcolm Ryder, and he's going to take us through this journey on what is designed thinking when it comes to organizational change management. I will be posting some things in the chat later on, some instructions, as well as I'll be monitoring the chat in case anybody has any questions or any comments that they want to send over to send to Malcolm. All right. So without further ado, I present you Malcolm Ryder.
Thank you, Manny. Hi, everybody. I just want to say right away, thanks for showing up at dinner time in the middle of a pandemic. So I guess the good news is it's not Friday. We're going to talk about design thinking and design thinking all the way through. We've got 90 minutes scheduled, and we'll pause a couple of times to try to get some feedback from you all. So I'm going to just jump right in and start out by saying that design thinking is one of those things that everybody sees everywhere now. The opportunity to get familiar with it is pretty much endless. And so if we get a bunch of people together today, we're going to have some people who already know a lot about it, other people who don't know much about it. And because of that, what I'm going to focus on is a bit high level, but we just want to mainly pay attention to the relationship between design thinking and change management. Maybe give me a second here, as I'm not getting the slide to change. All right, well, we're starting out with a little technical difficulty. Let's take 1 second. I'm going to close and open again, see if we get going. Okay, so here's what we're going to cover today. What is it about design thinking that we need to know, and why should you, as a change management professional, even care about it? And once we've talked through it a bit, then how should you think about using it when you're back at your place on a day-to-day basis? And I think most of all, we want to understand, what does it do that you don't already do? Now, that's important to me in talking about it, because I know that a lot of what we're going to mention in the next hour or so are ideas, terms, things that are related to design thinking that you already know about, you're already familiar with. But what we're going to be paying attention to is how to organize a lot of those same things, and that organization may be a little bit different than before. So this is more like a class than a show. So I'm going to ask you to not multitask if you're able to do that where you are now. And in the chat session, if you have questions along the way, you can just go ahead and drop your questions in there. We'll be sure to take some time to go and work with those questions before we're finished. Also, 3 or 4 times, we're going to stop and ask you to give us some feedback by taking a really simple type of a poll. And we'll all be able to see the answers right away. And depending on how interesting they are, we'll take a few minutes and talk about those answers as well. Finally, all of this is being recorded. So if you do miss something or you have to step away earlier, don't worry. It'll be waiting for you in a place that's easy to get to it later on, and you can review it all at your convenience, as well as getting in touch with us. So our contact information is also in the chat box. So we'll look at the basic concepts and then we'll talk about them a bit. There will be a recap somewhere between 60 and 80 minutes from now. And then we'll look at taking some questions from you. So to start out with, if you ask most people, what is design and what is change? Their intuitive understanding of it is that design is something that happens before you start taking action. And change, of course, is the action. So that makes the relationship between the two seem pretty straightforward. But here what I'm pointing at is that it's a better relationship than that. And they overlap. They don't just follow one after the other. So when we look at design thinking, what we find out is that it's primarily a problem-solving approach. It gives us a pattern of ideas and activities that we can follow. And the expected outcome is something that everybody calls a solution. In change management, we're also exercising some controls. We feel like we're on a pathway. And the ultimate intention is that we're going to come up with a future state that we're going to deliver to someone who's been waiting for it. And for them, that future state is a solution. So these are two different approaches to solving things, but they don't have the same problems. In particular, they don't have the same problems with success and failure. The big problem with change management is that everybody can do everything that was intended, everything that was expected, and things can get to some point of completion, but it might not be accepted. And our experience with change management, unfortunately, too often, is that completed managed change is just not adopted, even though in some realistic terms, it was finished. So when we have a failure to adopt, then that's a failure to change. All along through the presentation today, you're going to see a lot of these slides have a lot of words on them, but the reason for that is we basically compiled a notebook here for you that you can use after we're done today. So I'll try to avoid just reading the slides to you, but I'll be referring to the fewest number of terms that I need to keep the flow going. And again, we'll be looking in the chat box to make sure that we're following along. Design thinking in particular is special to us because it is very, very focused right from the beginning on making sure that the eventual outcome has high relevance to whoever the recipients are. And that is the key thing about whether it's going to be adopted. And if it's being adopted, it's because it has value. So we're looking into design thinking because it gives us that kind of perspective and it gives us that kind of support. The other big thing that it does is it helps to make us more aware that we're making this effort inside of an organization. And if we are successful at managing the change to a valuable outcome, the organization gets changed as well. So another thing that design thinking helps us to stay sensitive to is the alignment between the effort that we're making and the organization that's hosting that effort. So we'll go on and survey how the design thinking perspective contributes to our approach for changing not just what we think of as the subject matter of the change, but actually changing the organization's ability to change. And we'll keep those two things as tightly linked as we can. Here's some of the basic concepts. And what's good about this picture is a number of things that are found both in design thinking and in change management. And I like this chart because there are a lot of different ways to read it. You can look at the diagonals from top to bottom, from left to right, and so forth. And depending on which way you look at it, it kind of tells you a story of one type or another. And we didn't actually intentionally set this up so that the orange ones were popping out. But I guess out of all the different ways to read this, that's the main narrative that we're working with here. As change managers, we're going to confront complexity. We have to deal with that complexity with capabilities. And if we're good at that, then there will be value that's provided in the form of the future state because our change will be adopted. So although we're going to talk about complexity and get down a little bit into the weeds, the high level story is pretty much what you see on the screen there. Later, when you have this in your hands, I hope you'll take a look at this in several different ways. And feel free to share with us things that you think you discover in it. The most important thing that we're going to follow up on from this, though, is stuff that gets in the way. A lot of these concepts have to do with inhibitors to change, inhibitors to success, inhibitors to alignment. And so you see some of these words like ambiguity, volatility, terms like that. Those are warning signs. And we're going to talk about how they fit into the overall picture at a little bit deeper level of detail. So you may have heard the story about change that's usually reported these days, success and failure rates. I'll probably say this 2 or 3 times along the way. But one of the big issues right now is that failure rates for change are still being reported after 25 years or more at being about 66 to 75% failure. Now then there's a lot of debate about what does failure mean and so on. I won't go into all of that today, but I will reiterate that when we come to a point of completion, whether that's by consensus or necessity, if the future state that's been created with our managed change effort is not relevant and does not have value to the recipients, then they will not accept and adopt it, and that is what failure means. The interesting thing here is that at the point where that failure becomes the evaluation, the value that was necessary may not be the same value that was called for when we first started the change effort. So this is pretty tricky, and we're going to talk about that as well. But we're going to have this theme come up over and over again, which is that successful change is one that has relevance and value at the time that it is offered, whether those terms are the same as they were at the beginning or not. And what that does is it throws all of the emphasis on the stakeholders. So while we're trying to get the change done, we can have some pretty difficult experiences, like the target that we're aiming at keeps moving, or we're interrupted unexpectedly, or there's competition from other priorities or other changes. Or the one that gets talked about, I think maybe the most, is that there's just a built-in resistance to making the change, even though we're all careful as managers to try to pick the right people and the right time and so forth. So we've looked at a lot of these variables for quite a while now. And one of the things that we've tried to do is to just group them and simplify them so that we can refer to them in a more consistent way. And today we keep seeing these themes recur, which are about confusion, and conflicts, and cultural resistance. So we're going to look at how that fits into the big picture as well. But to get you involved in this process, first we're going to do a little poll. You remember the chart that we just looked at, which had a lot of the vocabulary or the terminology that is shared by both design thinking and change management. So I'm going to pick out the ones that are about the inhibitors here. And what we want to ask you about is, of these three inhibitors and their definitions right here on the screen, which one of them is the most likely inhibitor to your organization's change success? So let's look at these definitions again. Ambiguity is about a lack of clarity. Everybody can see things, but they're not quite sure what it all adds up to. Complexity means that there are a lot of different factors that are independent, but they have to work together in order to get something done. And volatility means that the conditions in which we're trying to make the change are unstable. So of course that makes them less predictable as well. And usually it makes things more expensive, and because there are detours as we try to adjust to the instability, it takes more time and you may wind up not having in hand what you really need. So ambiguity, complexity, and volatility. Pick any one. In the chat window and on the following screen, you'll see how to take the poll. You can use your desktop, laptop, your web browser, or you can use your phone through text. So I'm going to put the poll up in the screen, and then we'll wait for you guys to make your picks, and then we'll look at the results. All right, Manny, here we go. We'll leave this here while you decide whether you want to use your phone or your browser. Okay, I can see some choices coming in. Okay, once we get up to 20 or 25, I'll start showing the results, and you all can keep going, and we'll see those results on the screen as they continue to come in. Okay, so already we're looking at about 2-to-1 ratio, very roughly, with complexity way out in front. Nothing on the volatility end, that's interesting. Holding pretty stable, complexity and ambiguity, 2-to-1 ratio, very roughly.
Hey Malcolm, some of us are having trouble with the link that was sent out.
Oh, okay. Manny, let's check that in the chat.
I just posted up a new one here recently, and I'll repost it one more time.
Great.
The new link works. Thank you.
Terrific. Okay, volatility sneaking in. Now, given the definitions that we're working with, it's not hard to understand what these results reflect. And of course, not all organizations are the same. So we're seeing that just the idea of managing a change starts out with some variety depending on where you're trying to get that done. And the moral of the story, of course, is that one size does not fit all. So we're going to talk about that more specifically very soon. It's not surprising to see complexity in the lead. Volatility, maybe not as often an impact because after all, we tend to plan things before we get going. And as part of that planning, we're doing a bit of risk mitigation. Ambiguity also is, well, the definition is simple. But remember that we've already said that one of the things that design thinking does for us is to start sensitizing us to the stakeholders right from the very beginning. And if you have a very mixed stakeholder group, two or three things could happen. One, of course, is that not everybody agrees on what something means. And the flip side of that coin is that some people just don't understand what the proposed change really means. I'll say really means in quotes, because they can't anticipate what the scope of the impact is going to be or how long it's going to be before they get a benefit from it, or whether they're just more observers than they are participants. All of that figures into ambiguity. And the reason why that's an inhibitor is because it keeps people from engaging and committing to the change. Complexity just makes things potentially a lot more difficult. Volatility sometimes is just something that you can't avoid. A lot of changes are taking place because it's, I'll call it an emergency just to flavor the idea. And it's an emergency because things are already pretty unstable, and the part of the reason why we're doing the change is to try to restabilize them. So that's some of the most difficult type of change. It also turns out to be often the most conflicted among the organizational stakeholders who will predispose whether the change is going to fail or not. Okay, so I think we get the idea from here. I'm going to go ahead and step forward. I think, Manny, when I leave this screen, it's going to stop the voting. Is that right? But this will be recorded, so later on, when you come back to it, it'll remind you of what you were thinking about right now.
Yes, it will stop the responses.
Okay. So let's go ahead to the next step in our talk. So we just looked at inhibitors. Now let's think about acceptance. Here's a very interesting picture that is easy to find on the web. This was put together by Paul Gibbons, who also has been a speaker to ACMP. So he's a colleague, spiritual guide. What Paul put together here was a very interesting and convenient apples to apples comparison of the best known things that have been referred to as change management process models. So I'm going to point right away, though, to what's over on the far right, which is that the client acceptance pulls all the activity from the left-hand side of these so-called models to the right-hand side. That's what they all have in common. And if you look at them, look at the overall picture from top to bottom, what you see that Paul has done is he's tried to align things as best he could so that there's some consistency vertically. And what that tells us is that these are several different flavors of the same thing. And among this collection, he's included design thinking. And that was a pretty interesting decision to make, to put it in here, at least because the other ones that you can see here, their claim to fame was about change management. Design thinking did not come out of the chute being about change management. but it has a very, very similar influence. So we're going to peel that one off away from these others and take a closer look at it so we can see why it made sense to include it with all of these other process models for change management. Now, since acceptance is the goal that we're aiming for, it's fair to try to come up with a group perspective on that before we get further into the details. So we'll do another quick poll. And I want to start out by just saying that change happens all the time, whether we want it to or not, or whether we're managing it or not. So it's important to just always remember that, because management is not automatic. It always has a pretty singular purpose, which is to make sure that the change which takes place winds up being something that we want. So this time we're just going to ask at your organization, which of these three areas, as they're defined here, are the area where you think the biggest risk to the eventual acceptance of your changes lives today? Because management's going to have to zero in on that. So I think these definitions are pretty short. I'll do you a favor and not read them off. I'll give you a couple more seconds to see them. And we'll vote again, just like we did before. Okay, I'm going to switch over to the actual poll. You can use your desktop or your phone, just like before. Remember, you can only pick one. All right, we see some results coming in. I'll do what I did before and wait till we get 20 to 25, and then we'll put them on the screen so that if there are any differences, they'll be easier to see. Okay, one more. All right, not as many results so far. I don't know whether that means this is harder or a no-brainer. I'll go ahead and show what we have right now, and you can continue to vote. Oops. Get back up here. Show the responses. Wow, that's pretty dramatic. So I'm curious to know if this is what you all expected, but we're still seeing some changes, so we'll hang on for a minute. Okay, now these are pretty typical in the way that they relate to the eventual success or failure of the change being accepted. I guess support's pretty straightforward. It's always an issue whether the other two are part of the problem or not. But let's look at familiarity. Dwell on that just for a second. Recognition of how the change is supposed to cause an effect. Well, the main thing that happens there is a lot of people know that the change has been proposed, approved, possibly it's already underway, and they're being asked to respect it, or at least tolerate it, if not actually support it. but they're not really convinced that they know whether it has to happen or what side effects there are going to be and things like that. So that's a problem. Also, most change managers are familiar with the necessity to pick the right time to start these things and pick the right time block in which to continue working on them. But that's actually different timing from when that effort may start to be considered complete, which means the future state should be observable. We're kind of handing it over to somebody. And now we're looking at that issue of whether they're getting what they need at that time, regardless of what everybody thought was needed when we started. And I'll just go ahead and mention that support covers a lot of territory. It's not just resources, but it's also permission and attitude and some other human factors, some of which are formalized and some of which are not. Also, competition figures in to the support part of the equation because competition draws attention away from what we're working on, tries to move that attention to something else. So that's pretty tough as well. All part of the game though. So these floats look like they're pretty stable. So I'll move on to the next thing, which is going to be more about complexity. And remember how you voted before, because these pieces will fit together in the end. So what does a design thinker think about if you go to a design thinker and talk about change management? What is that person or what is that mentality looking for, and how does it think it should get involved or that it can help? So here's another point of comparison. And this is where I should point out that design thinking has its own internal debates and controversies. One of the largest discussion groups on LinkedIn is a design thinking discussion group that has hundreds of thousands of people in it. And it's been around for a while. And the debates that go on there today are pretty much the same ones that were going on there 5 or 6 years ago. And one of the ideas about design thinking sounds simple and it sounds really useful when you first hear it. It says, well, design thinking is thinking the way designers think. Now, that's not wrong, but it's had the unfortunate side effect of sending out this message that if you learn to think like a designer, then you can be a designer too. And the real world proves that that's not true. So we've looked at a lot of research in there and tried to figure out if there was another way to describe the most important things to understand about design thinking so that we can take those observations and use them in a better way when we're talking about change management. And this means that we're looking for some parallels as well. So some of what you see on the screen here seems almost too simple. The opposite of designed is not designed. But it's incredible how much debate works against that idea. So what we want to stay focused on is that if somebody's designing something, what they're doing is they're intentionally trying to influence the future state so that the future state is preferred. That's the point of doing it. So that's exactly why it is relevant to managing a change. What design thinking then helps us a lot with, however, is not only that starting point where we're really sensitive to what the stakeholders' needs are and we start projecting a bit into the future from there. But it also helps us to to maintain our sensitivity to complexity. So let's drill down in that a little bit. I wonder how many of you have seen this picture before. I probably take a look at it about every 2 weeks because it keeps me in line. If we had to depend on miracles, not very many things would come out right. But it often feels like what we're trying to do is to fill in that fuzzy part in the middle. As managers, that is. So you remember seeing this design thinking model. I've stripped it away from all the others. And although it has 5 parts to it, empathize, define, ideate, prototype, and test, I've bundled them here to make it more obvious that they're tackling 3 very basic issues. Are people working on the right thing to begin with? And is that thing understood by everybody? Is it the right time of thing, the right type of thing to be working on? And are we working on it in the right way? And finally, is it going to be acceptable? How do we know it's going to be acceptable at the time that we're trying to make that the new normal or the next normal? And design thinking helps us to respect the fact that complexity is everywhere in these 3 problems. It's not the same everywhere, but it is everywhere. And that will affect relevance. Relevance affects value, and value affects whether it's going to be accepted and adopted. So if we want to get past this 66 to 75% failure rate, we've got to deal with this. So here's a little bit closer view of what design thinking sees when it's thinking about change management. Over here in the upper left, sort of warning against starting out in a bad on a bad footing. So if you're starting out with disagreement or bias, and then you try to push forward or to make progress, 2 things you can count on that are going to kick back are volatility and ambiguity. So we've got our red arrows here pushing back. The gray ones are trying to go forward. And if these things don't get resolved, you can imagine that you'll be spinning your wheels for quite some time. And if this starts happening to you, then your idea of scope and your idea of timing starts to go out the window. So of course, what it means is we want to be sensitive to this possibility in the beginning and try to organize ourselves in such a way that we know what to do if we encounter these issues. And if we can get them out of the way, then that's the best case scenario. So here's another way of kind of telling that same story, but if you look across the bottom here, you see the keywords: stakeholders, production, and the target environment. So each of these is a different story, and then those stories are going to have to line up. Design thinking is really good at helping us to identify these stories and line them up with each other. And these 3 different things are looking at 3 different kinds of inhibitors, but we can start thinking about them as success factors and risk factors, get a better grip on them. So in the beginning, when we're looking at the stakeholders to try to figure out what the right thing is to do, we know that we're already thinking ahead in terms of our level of certainty about what the future value is going to be from this effort to manage the change. And we get a level of confidence there. And then we move on. And now there is a shared sense of what ought to be done. And we start thinking more about how to get it done. and how to demonstrate that we're doing it the right way. And that's the second part of the story. And then the third part is, what about those unintended side effects? We're making a change inside an environment that is changing all around us while we're trying to make a change. So there's always a possibility that we're provoking things that weren't really part of our plan, or that stuff's just happening to us that we can't ignore. And some of that may be happening in a way that stops us in our tracks. And some of it may be things that weren't going to happen, except for the fact that we provoke them with our effort. So I think everybody's heard of the butterfly effect. And maybe some of us have done a little bit of deep dives into chaos theory and so on. But what we're really talking about here is systems. It's that the activity that we manage, that we're calling change, is happening in a system, in fact, in a couple of systems. And so the results are going to be systemic effects. And the reason why we need to think about that explicitly is because approaching change as managers isn't necessarily something that will work out or make sense if all you're thinking is that it's a process with a starting point, a middle, and an end point, and you've got your instructions or your plan along the way. Systems often just don't work that way. So we need to understand what the system is and how to fit into it, and whether we need to try to change the system or just leverage it. So we're going to talk about systems, but we'll talk about it in terms of complexity. And I was saying that we're looking for success factors and risk factors. So here's a way to picture that. And if you look at the lower right, you can see our legend there. So we've got 4 issues to think about. Now, the success rate problem we've talked about 2 or 3 times already. And in this diagram, what we're talking about regarding success rates is that there's a relationship between relevance and acceptance. So since you've heard that a few times already as well, we can state some of the other factors in a similar fashion. So the number 2 issue in here is about the stakeholders. There are a lot of stakeholders. They don't all have the same need or the same desire. But at the end of our change effort, we're looking for acceptance. And so we're also talking about, well, who's going to do the accepting? And for those that didn't accept it, what does that mean? The third thing, we're referring to it as sustainability. And ambiguity comes in here, and it's got a relationship with the variability that we notice from stakeholders, groups, and also from the different options that we may have on how to pursue a change. When we talked about ambiguity earlier, we talked about the fact that some people who are involved, either as participants or as affected parties, don't really understand what the proposed change really means. It's not quite fitting into their worldview or their plans. They're not entirely convinced. And the worst case scenario is that they weren't consulted effectively in the beginning, so they didn't get a chance to shape those intentions and those expectations. So what's the chance that they're going to find the eventual outcome to be relevant? It's very hard to predict. So there's already a lot of complexity built into the picture. And we need a way to deal with complexity because we can't just make it go away. So what we have seen in our research is that the 2 key things for dealing with the complexity are strategy and priority. And we can look at a little bit more closely at that. And when you get this in your own hands, you'll see that we stepped through them one at a time. If you print it out or put it on the wall, you can make notes about each of these 4 things, compare it to what you know, what you're experiencing, or what you think you're being asked to do. And if that gives you new ideas, then that's exactly what we're looking for. And we hope that you'll share some of that with us. But this is our simplest representation of what complexity means in the share view that you get from design thinking and change management. Now remember, at this point, if you want to raise questions or object or whatever your thought is, you can put it in the chat box, and we're going to have some time to get back to that before we stop. Okay, we'll prompt you a little bit to get that going. Here's our third poll. We're really focused on priority. Priority is what compels management attention to the change. Remember, we've said that change is going to happen whether we manage it or not, and whether we want it or not. So we jump in with management. We immediately face complexity. We need a way to deal with that complexity. And there's no single thing that is more important than priority. The question is, who gets to set the priority? So this time what you're voting on is, in your organization, who do you think should have the most responsibility for setting the current priority of a change in progress? So who should have that responsibility? And what is the current priority that's going to be set? So we picked 3 different groups or roles. And what we've described here is what each one of them has that the other 2 don't have as much of. So you can use these definitions to cast your vote, and we'll see what you come up with. Okay, these are coming in a little faster. But I'm going to start showing these now so you can see what's coming up. Just keep on voting if you haven't voted yet. Okay, we'll give you another 15, 30 seconds to vote. But what we can see already is, and remember the question was, who should have the responsibility for setting the current priority?
Yeah, Malcolm, we have a comment in the chat.
All right.
BJ states, it depends on where your change falls under the spectrum of incremental to transformational.
That's great. PJ, hold that thought. We may ask you to say something about that in a little bit. And I think you're right. I'm going to make a note to myself about that. I'll throw a different note out right now, which is that different organizations and their subunits are offered different opportunities to be the initiators of a change. And in some organizations, the house rules are, if it was your idea, you're going to be responsible for convincing the rest of us that it should have the priority that you think it should have. But then maybe that goes off to an approval group, and the approval group may agree with you, they may not. But once again, I think the moral of the story is that every organization is different. And depending on where the proposed change is initiated in the organization, it could dramatically affect how priority is set. So this wasn't meant to be a trick question, but what we do want to understand in a very easy way is that if you're at the operator level, you got more facts from one day to the next than anybody else about what's being done and how it's going. And you're the early warning system, as well as the most reliable measuring stick for whether things are going well or not going so well. Managers may not have that same level of awareness or intimacy with those details. And they're trying to roll up things. They're trying to tell a complicated story more simply, often because they have to report to executives, and executives don't want to know all the details. But managers are going to check in. There'll be time sensitivity at the management level. We're all familiar with it. Hey, we should have been about here by now, and we're not there, so what's happening? So it's not the same level of detail as at the operator level, but it still carries a lot of weight. But managers don't always have the authority to say, we're going to change the way we're doing things. The executives almost always have the authority, of course, but they can make bad decisions because they can make decisions that aren't tightly aligned enough with the available facts and the details of what's going on. So there's going to be a dialogue in here somewhere. And managers and executives and operators are all stakeholders, along with the targeted customer or client, the end users, and so forth. So this is another source of complexity at the same time that it needs to be where resolving complexity gets most of its energy from. Okay, we'll go on to the next big idea. We're still talking about systems, but now I want to talk about feedback. And we're going to give you a little bit different vocabulary that design thinking actually helped to inspire when we're talking about change management as well. You can see here, we're talking about producing change. So what does that mean? So we'll tell you what we think that means and why it's important. Okay, so whatever we're going to be doing with the change effort, we can expect that there's going to be some degree of complexity, and we're trying to figure out how to deal with that. So we just looked at two things. Well, mostly one thing, which is priority. But we also said that strategy plays a big piece in here. Strategy is interesting enough and big enough so that I didn't want to drill into that today. So you'll have to trust me that we're thinking about it all the time. But during the question and answer session, if we want to talk about strategy, then that's a good time to do it. But first, we're going to just look at complexity and say, well, we need a way to deal with it. And so we've got two objectives, mainly to solve the right problem instead of the wrong problem and prioritize. Now, those are two things that could change while we're making the change effort. We can't forget that. Design thinking helps us to remember that that's going to happen or that it could happen. So here is one of the two most standardized representations of design thinking. This one's from Stanford. They're kind of the thought leaders in this. You can go there and get a degree on design thinking. And they call it a process diagram. So once again, it has this immediate message to us that there's a starting point, and over here it's on the left, and there's some kind of a finishing point, and it's oval on the right, and we're trying to get from the start to the end. So this is a recommendation, but calling it a process makes it seem simpler than it probably is. So even if we're not having an issue looking at design thinking's representation and saying, yes, empathize, we completely agree, we're sensitive to all the differences between stakeholders, we're probably including more parties as stakeholders than we used to. All good. But that doesn't mean that now we're just going to rip right through from left to right and be happy at the end. There's a very closely related diagram to this one. I'll show you that in 10 seconds. And that diagram is focused on just the first four parts of this one. And there's an interesting shift because the diagram you're about to see is not called a process diagram, it's called a model. And I think calling it a model is a better way to understand what it's offering us. But Stanford shows this picture and they always tell you, look, this is not necessarily linear. They're good about telling you, you need to know about these 6 parts here, but don't be surprised if you don't get to do them in this order. Here's the second diagram. This one may even be more familiar or more widely distributed than the Stanford diagram. This one was not created by Stanford, and it also was not created by the one guy named Tim Brown from a company called IDEO, who today is sort of the contemporary father of design thinking. But design thinking started way before Tim Brown became a household name. And this representation of it was created by an organization called the Design Council, which is a British organization. They put this together from a massive survey that they did in 2005. Everyone who thinks about design thinking for more than a couple of days in a row encounters this picture and immediately starts to get familiar with what it shows, which is that from left to right, you're doing some research, you're spending some time doing that, and while you're doing it, more and more ideas and more people get involved. So they call that divergence. Things are spreading out. There's a lot of stuff accumulating. Now you've got a lot of stuff to deal with, and you need to consolidate it, shrink it down, get more specific. So you go from the research stage to what they call synthesize, and that's shrinking or converging, and you get to this red dot right in the middle, which is the first time in the effort that somebody thinks, hey, we know what to work on, we know what people are going to want, so let's try to make it. So then you continue on in the rightward direction and you start making prototypes, basically. You're trying out different ways of creating what you think this new thing needs to be. But first you pile up a lot of different variations of it. And then you have to shrink it down to the one that you're really going to bet on in the end. So this is the pattern. It's called a double diamond. And it is a model. But the most important thing in this model is those arrows, those circular arrows that are reminding us that you don't necessarily get to keep going from left to right. Things happen that push you back to where you were before. You end up doing things over again. And because you expect it, if you're managing it, then you should have been doing something to accommodate that from the beginning. It can't be a surprise. So we've gone on to think more about how to get our arms around what that picture of design thinking means to us when we're managing change. So we had one goal already, which was basically to work on the right problem for the right reason and understand what the stakeholders thought about that. And now we're at the second goal, which is to be sure that we've done what we can to make sure to have that future state that we create adopted. And so the adaptations that we just performed need to be adopted. So, and when we say adoption, what we mean is you're at the future state, and because it was the right thing, you leave the prior state behind. You don't need it to be the way it used to be anymore. So that's a pretty decisive dividing line. And a lot of changes get a little bit past that line, but not all the way past. And those are going to be deemed, well, they're not going to be deemed successes. I'll put it that way. And maybe they get counted in that 66 to 75% that continues to be reported year after year after year, even though we have 50 years of models and 2 zillion certifications. We've relabeled these 4 main phases in the double diamond to get closer to the kind of activity that as managers we're going to bring to the party to exercise our influence to get that change to produce an outcome that's going to be adopted. So these 4 labels that you see here, assessment, profiling, capability, and production, those are our keywords for the management actions and the management focus in change. So that's how we characterize the overlap between design thinking and change management. Now, there's still the implication, at least, that there's a beginning point and there's some input in there, and that needs to be all about the stakeholders. And then thanks to our effort and to our management, we're going to come out with something that we intend to find acceptance of. And you can see these bullets are identical going in and coming out. But design thinking tells us this is going to be nonlinear. You may do things over and over again. We've tried to make that more explicit in a way that we could explain why that is probably the case most of the time. And so the story is, the longer we are working on it, the more feedback is going to get generated. And the more feedback that gets generated, the more likely it is that we're going to end up changing the way that we are doing things. It might be a little bit, it might be a lot, but we have the expectation that while we're making the effort, we're going to change the way that we're doing things. So here's what it really looks like. And there's a lot of arrows on here, but basically all it says is you start out with your assessment. And based on that assessment, you're going to create some profiles that give you a sense of organization about why you're going to do something and how you're going to do it and who's going to do it. But you might not find what you were expecting. And if you've done a good assessment and you do proper profiling, there's a very good chance that it's going to make you rethink, go back to step one, assessment. So you'll cycle through that for a bit, and maybe you get satisfied. You think your profiling's okay. Now you're looking around for the right types of skills, aptitude, experience, knowledge, and so on. And you're going to bring that into the effort based on the profiling. But there could be that gap between desire and reality, or the gap between need and availability. And so that's more feedback. It could push you backwards. And in fact, it could push you backwards in a way that starts a chain reaction and pushes you all the way back. And that's normal. That's not unusual. So then the same phenomenon continues. There's a relationship between the capability issue and the production issue. You don't know if you're going to have to back up a little bit or a lot. But in a management perspective, you come to it expecting it. And then if it turns out that it didn't happen, then you're better off than you were before. You were at least prepared. So this is nonlinear, but it's nonlinear enough so that it almost doesn't make sense to call it a process. What you're working through is a set of dynamic relationships in a system. And the more comfortable you are recognizing that you're working in a system, the more likely you are to succeed. So let's take one more poll. This is all about the feedback. And we're looking at 3 different aspects of feedback. Where's it coming from? How frequently do you get it? And when it's coming in, do you understand it? Now this poll, you're in the management role, so you don't have to worry about executives or operators, but there's other things. And you're a big influencer. So if no one else is paying attention to the feedback, you have to. So this time you're going to vote on which of these 3 things where you work is the most important issue about feedback for managers to take on as their responsibility. If you're getting feedback from someplace that you don't trust or you're not familiar with it, then maybe it doesn't seem very important or very credible. If you're not getting feedback in a timely way, it may as well not be coming in. And if you're getting feedback that people don't understand, or maybe you understand it, but you can't make anybody else understand it, then what's the possibility that you're going to be a beneficial influencer as a manager? So each one of these is pretty significant. One of them is not more important than the others, but all organizations are different. So you're just going to pick the one that you think characterizes where you work. And here we go. Okay, since we're later on in our overall time allotment, I'm going to go ahead and start showing these now. And you can keep voting. Okay, if we stopped right here, it would appear to say that a lot of organizations don't get timely feedback. a similar number of organizations, not as many, have some difficulty making sure that everybody understands the feedback that is available. And then to a lesser degree, the feedback that's available is just not coming from a trusted source. And when I say trusted source here, I absolutely have to include things like automated processes that are kicking out tracking information. Not just people. Now, I don't know if these ratios are going to change that much, but I want to be sure that we leave enough time for some question and answers. So we do have this one useful observation, though, which is that a lot of organizations don't think that they're getting feedback in a timely way. So, of course, that means it's harder for managers to do something about it, to do something effective. Okay, so what we're going to do to try to wrap up the conversation for the discussion here is to focus on alignment. And that's something that designers know a lot about, and that design thinking makes very explicit to us as a requirement. So what we want to emphasize today with you is that you're making a change effort inside of a system, and that system is the organization. So if you don't understand your organization as a system, then a lot of what you're doing is kind of speculative. So is that organization built for change? Is the way the organization itself set up in a way that promotes successful change, or is it more likely to get in the way? So there is a field of organizational design, and it's been around for a long time. I think if you look into it, what you're going to find is most of the emphasis in organizational design is aimed at what everybody calls performance improvement. It's not aimed at successful managed change. So historically speaking, right now, organizational design is beginning to pay more attention to change than it ever has before. And it's generating a lot of different ideas about what the organizational model should be like in order to promote successful change. But what they all have in common is they understand that alignment is the must-have. And when they're talking about alignment, they're talking about this. The only thing that's different here from what you saw a minute ago is we've started to just point out the numerous ways that the organization itself could change or doesn't change, which turns out to be part of the feedback. And it's systemic feedback. And it's going to predispose whether your change effort is going to go well or not go well. So of course, this will still be here for reference at your convenience later. But hopefully these are all pretty easy to recognize. We see them, we know they're happening. A lot of it may be outside of our individual scope of responsibility in our jobs, but we know that these things are important and we know that they have an influence. So it's good to get everybody aware in the same way. And that gives us a better chance of getting cooperation and giving cooperation of a kind that's more likely to succeed. So what does alignment look like? So here's what it looks like to us. We talked about doing 4 things as managers, and in this picture, each one of those 4 things looks in 2 different directions, but they wind up sharing concerns. And because they share concerns, they link together. And that's how you get alignment of these different issues. The range of stakeholders, why people take on roles that are needed, what interactions become available depending on how they cooperate, and what's the support that's available, the real support. And is that support of a type that will keep your effort aligned to the current value, whether that current value is the same that everybody initially thought it was or not. And when we think about the feedback and we think about the design thinking perspective, we know that that current value that's what counts. That's what's going to be the dividing line between what's deemed a success and what's deemed a failure. So here's a picture of the organization. We said it was a system. Here's what it looks like, a little bit simplified. Every organization has a culture. And we've given a really straightforward definition of what a culture is. So it's not philosophy, it's something that you can observe and measure and change. And inside that culture, there's an ecosystem. So here's a pretty simple definition of an ecosystem. Again, something that you can observe and measure and change. And because you can do that, you can start working on the alignment of the culture to the ecosystem. If they're completely disconnected from each other or they're competing with each other, things are not going to go well. Here's the third big dimension of the organizational system. And maybe I said this earlier, but there's a big difference between ability and capability. So what we want to remember is capability is potential. Ability is demonstrated fact. So here what we're doing is we're looking at the organization and asking, based on what we know about this place, what's the potential for doing things that need to get done? So this is an easy picture to use as a reference. And when you're looking around in your organization, you can catalog what you find. You can start thinking about whether those pieces fit together or not, what you might be able to do about it. And this is a view that's been inspired very largely by the way that design thinking approaches things. So this is pretty much the same picture. It's the same idea, of course, but cultures will evolve. And whether they're evolving or not, they're going to predispose things. Ecosystems need to be adaptive. All that networking that goes on in there, it needs to not be rigid, it needs to be flexible. And that flexibility needs to be supporting capability, which again is potential. So you develop the potential until you're actually able to do what needs to be done. So if any of you have worked with capability maturity models in the past, you'll want to have a capability maturity model for managed change as well. That's how we understand the organization as a system. So each one of these three things needs to be seen clearly, and if there are problems in there, resolved, and then they need to be aligned with each other. Now, getting that alignment to happen needs to be communicated in a way that people can understand and that helps them to participate. And the punchline here is that management is not just something that one person who has that word in their job title does. It's actually a community activity. And successful management is going to get people involved to share that responsibility in distinctive ways. They're all going to be contributors. So individual contributors are going to need to feel that there's a personal benefit from engaging that, from taking on that responsibility. And they need to collaborate with each other because they feel like they understand why that collaboration needs to take place, what's going to come out of that, and how it can be done in a flexible way. And the culture itself needs to permit and encourage and support at all times and share that goal of having the change effort produce an outcome that when it becomes available, it is preferred, it is valuable, so that it will be adopted. And depending on what your organization is like, you can come up with a description that's different from this, but similar in spirit. And that's going to turn into your campaign. It's how you'll tell the story of why things are going on the way they are. And it'll remind people why they should care. And it will encourage them to sign on. So again, each one of these three things needs to be taken care of on its own terms, but then they also need to link together. Okay, so some key ideas that came out of this. Change is, it looks linear, but it's not. A lot of things that are involved in the change happen at the same time. They make sense as a sequence of things, but as often as not, they don't get done that way. In particular, they may not get done that way because there's a lot of feedback that needs to be absorbed and accommodated and leveraged in order to keep going. The effort itself is not mechanical because it's taking place in a system. And so the system's going to affect it, and we may change that system as well. So some of the effects are nice to haves, some are have to haves, and maybe there's a lot of stuff that we didn't expect and that we didn't want. So when we talk about producing change, we're trying to shift our mentality from this idea of executing a change to cultivating the change. An organization that's built for change is constantly cultivating change. And it really is a different mindset. It may not seem so much like it's different until you start doing it that way. Because it's probably going to change the distribution of responsibilities, your measuring systems, and your communication. But all of that is aimed at producing value in a timely way within a scope that people agreed was appropriate, had the right priority, and they want it. So when they get it, they're ready to leave behind whatever it was that you just changed. Okay, I'll do this recap really fast. and we can use the remaining time to look at any questions that you may have that are going to be in the chat box. So what drove all of this from the beginning was we kept looking at this failure rate and trying to understand, why isn't it changing? Why isn't it getting better after all this time and all these models, certifications, thought leadership, and hundreds of thousands of practitioners? What's going on? So we think in a nutshell that the failure rate's not going down because most change efforts are either solving the wrong problem or they're doing it the wrong way. And the outcome of that is they finish and hand over something that at that time people decided they didn't want. And that's why it's called a failure. It's not called a failure because smart people came to the party and didn't do the right thing well. That's not why it failed. And we care about design thinking because it keeps us focused on this goal of timely value. And it keeps us sensitive to what's going to help that and what gets in the way. A little while back, we had an opportunity to present. Maybe some of you were at this earlier event. And at that time, we asked people, tell us what you think causes failure in your organization with managed change. And you can see from this word cloud what those responses were. And looking at this now, you can also see how each one of these fits into the bigger picture. So not everybody had the same experience. Not everybody said the same thing. But it's a bit more organized now. And you may do the same trick at home. And when you see these results, you'll know what to do about them. So here's your goal as a manager of change. If this wasn't your goal, you didn't need to be there. And here's what design thinking offers you. Its key ideas. And they fit into change management very nicely. And it's not the only thing that you'll use, but it's a really great perspective to bring to the effort as a manager. So in the beginning, we said, why should you care? If at this point you feel like you know what the answers are to these 4 questions, then this worked out. But if we only got you part way and you want to know more or you want to revisit something, we'll start on that right now with some questions, and then you can always contact us later.
All right. So we have about 2 minutes left before moving forward. Benasco Lamy had a question for you, Malcolm, and she
Okay.
wrote in the chat, as a long-term design thinking facilitator, always gets this questions from change managers on how to get the buy-in for design thinking in a fast-paced changing environment. Would love to see your perspectives, Malcolm. Thanks. She also has her hand raised up,
Okay.
and I will let her chime in here quickly after I promote Kathleen's current question to you,
Okay.
in which during the alignment section, she made the comment, nonlinear systems as an ecosystem flourishes with mutual reciprocity and responsibility. How do you design in responsibility by various human and non-human elements?
Uh, okay. I'm not sure if we have enough time to take on that second question sufficiently. But so let's first let one of our guests speak up, and then I'll go to the second question.
Okay, Benaz, would you like to ask your question? You can go ahead and unmute yourself.
Yeah, hello. So thank you very much for your perspective on design thinking. So I'm a design thinker, and I know how how sometimes it gets very theoretical, but yeah, well done in just your presentation. I really enjoy that. So my question is, so as a facilitator and also I'm a change manager, so I always like sit in between design thinking and change management to translate these two.
Mhm.
So but I think that the most concern in the change management field is like how to get the buy-in, because change is very fast-paced and people like leadership simply doesn't have time or like money to spend on such amount of qualitative data we gather and all these like feedback loops back and forth and all these things. So I would love to get your perspective on that, how to get the buy-in for like design thinking in a change management field in such a fast-paced environment. Thank you.
Okay. Well, I'll make two quick comments, and then that'll help us to continue this discussion with you after this event is over. But I'll tell everybody what I would talk about with you on that particular question. You remember in the beginning, we talked about having strategy and priority available at the same time, but then we didn't talk about strategy very much. But think of those two things as two legs of a three-legged stool, and the third leg is communication. In order to get the buy-in, I think it's going to sound simple. It's not really simple. It's not easy to do. But the key to buy-in is that people need to be able to see themselves as stakeholders in a role where they can see what their personal benefit is at the same time that they can see how it benefits the objective of the change. And the one instrument that is the most influential at getting people's mindset to that point is the change communication campaign. Nothing else by itself has more influence than that communication campaign. And so that campaign starts right at the very beginning by articulating what the strategy is. But it doesn't just keep talking about the strategy, it shifts very quickly to talking about why the participants and the change agents and the stakeholders are individually going to benefit. And sometimes that message gets lost in translation because it seems like it's coming down from way high up in the organization and it gets filtered 2 or 3 times by mid-level managers or supervisors. And then there's a big conversation that's going on, from the management level down. That's pretty unfortunate. And that also is not the way it happens in so-called flat organizations. But those key aspects of personal buy-in, simultaneously becoming aware of the personal benefit and the benefit to the objective is that's what needs to be established. So again, I'm not saying it's easy. It's easy to say, but if you don't do anything else, you've got to tell that story in order to make everything else work out better.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks. So it's all like goes to storytelling again.
Yeah, and in the design thinking scheme of things, most of that happens all in the beginning.
Yeah, exactly. Okay.
Now, I talked about doing assessments.
I would love to connect later with you. Thank you.
All right, terrific. Okay, we had another one, Manny?
Well, if Kathleen Curran would like to pose her question to you,
Okay.
Kathleen, go ahead and unmute yourself.
You read it out. I have nothing more to add to it, but you kind of already touched on the concept of responsibility when you spoke to alignment, and then even now in this answer about telling the story, that plants the seeds for the responsibility. But my question was about nonlinear systems are built on mutual responsibility.
Yeah.
And I wondered how you build in responsibility from the start.
Okay. So I'll tell you what my favorite answer is, because it's the one that I've seen work most easily. There's a concept of roles, and we talk about that a lot, and we're happy to talk about it a lot in the future. There's also something called service orientation. It's one of these things that IT people tend to know an awful lot about. And maybe this concept of service orientation is not expanding into other management viewpoints as quickly as I thought it would. But the general idea is that you have capabilities that are grouped among individuals who we already know want to perform in certain roles. And when their group convenes, they let it be known that other groups can expect certain things from them, and they can expect it at a pretty consistent level of quality or intensity or so on. And what happens in the organization is you create a collection and a network of services. And because the services are not hard to describe, they also actually become kind of open. In other words, you can advertise a service to the community of potential change agents and participants and operators, and have them subscribe themselves to the service by saying, I'm going to be available when it's time for that service to satisfy a demand. And that also turns out to be a key architectural concept for organizations that want to think of themselves as having a high degree of agility. So it's somewhat theoretical compared to a lot of what we're used to, particularly from the project management world, the conventional project management world. But it's actually becoming more frequently practiced. And there's some question as to whether it works better at one scale than another. But again, we've seen this a lot in the IT world. And it's incredibly successful at handling both change and scale in IT design. So we're inspired to look at organizational design using that same pattern. And it's a process of discovery, but smaller organizations they're not as afraid to try it. And they become good test cases. Then there are larger organizations that were actually already doing it, but they didn't think of themselves that way. So there's some pretty good research going on right now about networks of services and how do you translate that into organizational design. But there's also some other literature out there that has a very similar attitude, I'll say. And a lot of it came from the military. But there's a pretty famous piece of work out there called Teams of Teams. And I think that came right out of the counterinsurgency program and philosophy in the military. Billy McChrystal, I think, is the author, if not the inventor within the military context, but he's an interesting person. He's got a lot to say about this that's useful to us. So I could definitely endorse looking at it that way.
Yeah, thank you. That makes sense. I look at it from the human side as well. And I'm thinking also in a global organization, when headquarters is in one culture and you're trying to make this change worldwide, it's very difficult to get that sense of responsibility when people are far away.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
therefore, I think this would be a very nice way of building up the capabilities and also the sense of responsibility, but the visibility, because what's often lacking is no visibility, therefore inequities of access. So this would raise the visibility by being on the service network from unexpected places.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. And I'll just mention one other thing, which is that in my mind, and we can certainly go reality check this, some of the best known precedents for this is what used to be practiced and is still called as matrix management.
Oh, yeah.
But I think matrix management had a built-in flaw or two. One of them had to do with reporting, and the other one had to do with, frankly, with just politics, the politics of accountability. So service networking doesn't have those two problems, but surely it has some distinctive problems of its own.
Interesting. I can carry on with this conversation, but I won't take everyone's time.
Well, we'll figure out a way to get together again.
Thank you very much.
Sure.
Yeah. So earlier in the chat, I had placed Malcolm's LinkedIn URL as well as mine's. So if you need that, I can go ahead and put that back up again for everybody who wants to either contact him or I. And if you want to continue the discussion about the design thinking and what we're doing with that. Okay, so
Thank you, man.
I think we're at the end here. I'm actually surprised there's still 15 people here listening, to be honest with you. I thought everybody would be tired by now.
Yeah.
But we really appreciate everybody staying on during this evening as part of this discussion. There is more to come. Please, if you have any feedback about this session or any others that has been presented at ACMP Texas, please email me. And I had put my email in the chat, and I will do it again if I need to. Actually, let me do it now.
Okay.
Okay, so there is my email here at ACMP Texas. Please reach out to me about how would you like this session? How would you like any of the other sessions? What would you like to see more of? Because we are talking and looking into what we're going to do next year. All right, so please feel free to reach out to me. All right, if there are no further questions, then we will stop the session here tonight. I appreciate everybody who had came in, and enjoy the rest of your evening.
All right. Thank you. Thank you, everybody. I hope to